Book 4, Falcon in the Barn, Chapter 11. Men, it's our turn to go hunting. A week later, and 3 weeks after the remembrance ceremony, Colonel Shin sat at another officers' meeting, but this one was much larger, and better well attended by a dozen men seated at the large table with him. The meeting was being held behind locked doors in the side training room off the mess hall. Across from Perrin at the rectangular table sat Master Sergeant Zenas, then Lieutenant Colonel Karna and his lieutenant to one side, and Major Jordan and his master sergeant on the other. Along a shorter side was Major Fod and one of his assistants, and across from them were Sergeant Major Beneff, because Perrin couldn't come up with a reason to exclude him, and Captain Thorne. Thorne was actually closest to Perrin, who occupied one long side of the table all by himself, where he'd spread tidy stacks of pages and notes. But Thorne had a manner of sitting away from his commander that suggested much more distance than there really was. He had learned to sit smallly, and for once Perrin approved of his behavior. Seated behind the table were 3 more sergeants, accompanying their commanders who had traveled there to keep careful notes of the conversation. "I appreciate all of you attending today," Perrin began, "and I realize the fort at Rivers would have been a more central site, but seeing as how I'm still wedded to Edge's borders." The officers rolled their eyes at Colonel Shin's extended probation, except for Captain Thorne, who sat stoically, if not uneasily. But there was nothing Perrin wanted to do more on the anniversary of his parents' death than to conduct this meeting. "I appreciate all of you journeying to Edge to join us." "Any time, Colonel, you know that," said Lieutenant Colonel Karna. Major Fod of Quake nodded, and Major Jordan of Mount Seine said, "I'm sure all of this will die down again soon, Colonel. Just give Idamia a little more time to forget how loved you are, and you'll be a free man again." Jordan emphasized his point with a confident slap on the table. Perrin smiled. Jordan's hand would be red by the end of the meeting, making Perrin wish that Thorne's back was in smacking distance. The major wasn't nicknamed Roarin' Jordan for nothing. While his skin was the usual light reddish brown, and he was of usual height, he was, however, of unusual strength and ferocity when provoked. He kept his head shaved as smooth as his firm chin, so that even his scalp looked muscular. He was the one you wanted on your side in a fight, and someone to run away from if he were rooting for the other man. Even though he didn't enter the university until his late 20s, he soared through the ranks. That was probably why he was headquartered far away from Idamia, just like Perrin. Sergeant Major Beneff shook his head. "Not so sure about it all dying down, Major, with all due respect, ho-ho. The cows know how to smell the sunset, after all." Perrin was used to this, the silent pause that hung in the air after one of Beneff's bits of knowledge fluttered to the ground, and everyone stared at it, wondering what in the world that was. A few of the officers looked at Perrin for an explanation, but he merely shook his head to indicate they really didn't want to pursue it. Who he felt sorry for were the enlisted men sitting against the wall taking notes from their commanders. The 3 other scribes looked at Perrin's, who closed his eyes and silently sniggered. "Not sure about all of it dying down at all, hi-ho. Have you heard about the play?" Perrin rubbed his forehead as Karna chuckled. "I have." Perrin raised an inquisitive eyebrow at him. Sergeant Zenas's snort caught Perrin's attention next, and Shem quickly shook his head apologetically. The 2 majors sat up taller. "Well, I haven't," said Fod, with a cautious glance at the colonel. Perrin was surprised at his interest. Major Grayson Fod was taller than Jordan, slender, darker brown skin with black hair, and a perfect foil for Jordan. As roaring as Jordan was, Fod was quiet, thoughtful, and reserved. That made him an exceptionally sharp man and allowed him to notice nearly everything, except for maybe one thing. "What play, Beneff?" "We do not need to hear about that right now," said Perrin firmly. But his reticence intrigued Jordan. "Oh, then I think we do. Come on, Beneff, out with it." Slap. Beneff smiled at the major's encouragement and didn't notice his commander trying to stare him down. Seems they're practicing down in Orchards right now. Best place come out of there, you know. Course, I don't really know. That's just what I hear, hum, and one should never ask the rock where the dirt is. Jordan's eyebrows furrowed at that one. My brother and his wife live there, Beneff droned on. She loves the actors, that woman does. She'd drag us out to everything they put on. Rather glad I got transferred up here. Karna made a rolling motion with his hand at Beneff, encouraging him to get to the point. Perrin just sighed and made himself comfortable. Once the floor was given to Beneff, he wouldn't give it up until he had covered it all. Yes, the play is all about our colonel here, called The Midnight Ride of Perrin Shin. About the caravan and the attack and the delivery to Edge, he grinned. My sister-in-law says it's very moving, but you know, if the boot leaks, check with the bakers. Perrin was used to skipping over Beneff's rambling, but Major Fod was now leaning earnestly toward the doddering old fool, as if determined to discern some pattern to the randomness. All kinds of costumes, scenes, movement, noise, ho. My sister-in-law sits in on the practices with her friends, whole collection of biddies with their yarn and their stick things and so. He tried to make knitting motions with his hands. Perrin sighed louder and looked up at the ceiling, wondering if it needed patching. The other soldiers began to smirk. Supposed to open in pools in just a few weeks, the play, that is, and it will be all the rage, Beneff predicted. The lead is that popular young buck, what's his name? He said, snapping his fingers. Straw, reed, wool. Karna squinted. Weaves? Perrin raised both eyebrows at Brillin that time. Yes, Beneff slapped the table in Jordan fashion. It was contagious. All of them would be doing it by the end of the meeting. That's the man. Brillin burst into a grin. That's the name written all over the other side of my niece's slate. He turned to Perrin. Nice going there. Apparently every female under 50 loves him. The majors began to laugh, and their assistants covered their mouths just in case their laughter wasn't appropriate. Shin glared at Karna. Brillin and Shem tried to hide their smiles, but not too hard. Only Thorne sat stony-faced. Oh, yes, Beneff agreed. Excellent bit of casting there, hey. Couldn't find a more popular actor, even if the flowers weren't blooming purple. Perrin's mouth began to twitch, curiosity getting to him. Has he ever been to Edge? Beneff shook his head. Edge? Oh, that's a laugh. Edge for weaves. He's too popular to have ever been here. But then again, I imagine they tried to bring the production up. No. Perrin shook his head. Definitely not. Shem snorted into his sleeve and tried to pretend it was a sneeze. Oh, I don't know, Colonel, Beneff said slowly. Quite the thing it would be, hum, eh? Now, while we all know that spiders have different opinions about the cat, I'd be interested to see how they make that handsome young buck look as old as you. Oh, he's only in his late 20s, if that. Shem's next snort was so loud that Brillin slapped him on the back as a warning. He started coughing in a meager attempt to cover his laugh. The majors and lieutenant colonel pressed their lips firmly and stared at anything else but the colonel. Their assistants sitting next to them followed suit, because Perrin's glare at Beneff had become deadly. But the old coot didn't notice. You see, he said, turning to Karna's lieutenant, I've seen how they transform someone into another. Quite clever, really. They have these squishy cushions, he gestured a bit aggressively, that they put under the clothing to make someone appear bigger and fatter. Perrin felt himself sucking in his gut ever so subtly. His trouser size had increased maybe 2 or 3 inches since he was a lieutenant, but still. He glanced at Shem to see if he noticed, but Master Sergeant Zenas was staring at his lap, his shoulders spasming every few seconds. Then, Beneff continued enthusiastically, now looking at Major Jordan's Master Sergeant, who held his face surprisingly well, except for the twitching near the corners of his mouth. They put this powder in the hair to make it all gray. I'm only starting to go gray, said Perrin quietly. There were indefinable noises that emanated from nearly every soldier, mostly from their mouths and noses, except for Thorne, who remained and sat completely still. Well, of course, sir, but for dramatic effect, you see, Beneff explained. He focused all of his attention on poor, struggling Zenas. Shem's shoulders kept shaking, and he refused to look up. Then they take this special charcoal ho-ho and draw the lines all around the eyes and mouth to emphasize all the wrinkles. A violent outbreak of coughing and snorting and backslapping struck the officers and their assistants. Perrin had finally had enough. Sergeant Beneff, some of the men had deadlines to keep after all. We can discuss this later. Out of the corner of his eye, Perrin noticed that Shem was now hiding his face in both of his hands and shaking uncontrollably. Only Thorne, of all the men in the room, maintained his complete composure. Apparently, Perrin decided, there was a benefit to having no natural sense of humor. Well, of course, sir, said Beneff innocently. You're correct, and with cake on the side, ho-hum. We should be getting to your business, sir. Thank you, Beneff, said Perrin generously, and he surveyed the condition of the men in the room. Some were bravely looking directly at him, practicing their serious faces, while the others cleared their throats, coughed, wiped their eyes, or repositioned themselves in their seats. After a few moments, the only one not near any semblance of attention was Shem, who was still vibrating. Something painful happened to him under the table, either from Karna on his left or Jordan on his right. By their demeanors, it may have been both, which made him jump in his seat. Finally, Master Sergeant Zenas looked up with tears of suppressed laughter and now pain welling in his eyes. Colonel Shin gave him a few seconds before saying, Do you need to be excused for a while, Master Sergeant? Zenas's mouth moved in a variety of ways before he eventually muttered a painful, No, sir. The smallest hint of a satisfied smile crept around Perrin's eyes. Shem was probably the only man who recognized it. Then may we get to the situation at hand, Zenas? Shem nodded and put a hand to his mouth just in case. Perrin exhaled and leaned forward in his chair. With the entertainment portion of the meeting concluded, it was time for business. You all know by now that garters have taken over some of the houses in Moorland. The longer we let them be comfortable there, the more brazen they'll be when they attack. With the weather warming, I doubt it will be long before they come to Edge, or Mount Scene, or Rivers, or even Quake. Without pausing to let the commanders add their comments to their nodding in agreement, he hit them with, Gentlemen, I've asked you here to propose that we join together and go after them first. Perrin fully expected the outburst of responses and hoped that Thorne noted that he was now seeing his first officer's argument, the way an officers' meeting should be conducted. An offensive hit. We strike first? That's never been done before. What does the High General think of this? What kind of precedent will that set? Perrin waited for the surprise to die down before he continued. I know this is uncharacteristic of the way this army has acted in the past. We've always been organized for purely defensive reasons. But I fail to see how sitting and waiting like a young buck in hunting season, he glanced at Beneff, is going to preserve our villages. We know where they are for the first time, and we have people who know the area. A farmer working the fields across the road here used to live in Moorland. Mr. Brider has helped me create a detailed map of the area and mark the houses which remained intact after the land tremor. Those will be most likely the structures sheltering the garters. If we combine the forces of our 4 forts and hit them with one major strike, we could wipe them out. Men, it's our turn to go hunting. The soldiers sat quietly stunned at the table, considering the idea, and Perrin worked his shoulders deeper into the chair, waiting. They would see it, he was sure, the obvious solution. Fod was the first to slowly begin nodding. It could work. We could scout out the area again and see how many there are. No, said Perrin firmly. They always see us before we see them. Sending scouts would alarm them to our presence, and maybe even to our intentions. We need to catch them unaware. We make a full-force strike with everything we have. 1,000 armed men ought to eliminate whoever's hiding there. Someone at the table let out a low whistle. And what does the High General think of this? Thorne's voice was thin. Perrin had known it was the captain who had asked that earlier, and he'd been waiting to hear it again. He interlocked his fingers in front of him and leaned to his side. I don't know, Captain. I haven't bothered to ask him. I suppose you could have discussed it when you were at the dinner, but I didn't have my plans completed then. High General Cush never seems to respond to my messages anyway. Do you know why that is? Actually, Perrin had sent only 2 unimportant messages about how many forms he was supposed to keep on hand at all times, or if he could just burn down the fort instead, just to see if anyone was paying attention at the garrison. No one was. Captain Thorne shifted restlessly in his chair and looked around the table. Every eye was on him, and none of them friendly, Perrin noticed with no small sense of satisfaction. No, sir, I don't, Thorne said, but I'll send General Thorne a message directly after this meeting if you wish. I'll take care of the messages to the advisor myself, Captain Thorne, Perrin informed him. Turning to the rest of the officers, he said, Here's the first problem of several. While I have a plan of attack drafted and ready, I'm not able to lead the attack myself, since I can't go beyond the borders of the furthest farm, still 3 miles from Moorland. The owner of that farm has already agreed to postpone planting his crops, so we can use the land as a staging area. The fort at Edge can keep us supplied, and I can direct from that point, but others will have to lead the attack should you agree to the plan. Agree to this plan? Agree to everything, sir, Major Jordan said with a broad grin. And if no one here minds, I'd be honored to lead the attack. Perhaps if we have an officer from each fort leading different sections, it will help unify the men under one commander. For example, if young Thorne here would represent Edge. Zenas cleared his throat loudly. Major, excuse me, but Colonel? Yes, Zenas. Perrin could see exactly what Shem was thinking. The captain couldn't be trusted further than he could be thrown. Zenas looked around the table and caught Thorne's gaze. Thorne's face remained stony, but a definite spark of fear was in his eyes. Shem noticed it, too, and he leaned back, a little less worried. I'm sorry, sir. Never mind. Please go on, Major Jordan. As I was saying, Captain Thorne could lead the Edge contingency under my guidance, of course. He nodded to Zenas next to him, and really earned those patches on his uniform. Fod smiled. This idea is getting better and better, and I would be honored to join Colonel Shin at the staging area and let my captain have the opportunity to earn his patches as well. Fod gripped his captain's shoulder and shook it. Fod's captain sat taller and nodded at Major Jordan. Absolutely, sir. Quake will proudly serve next to Mount Scene to eliminate the garters in Moorland. I welcome the opportunity. I've served for 6 years and look forward to some real action. He shot a quick look to Thorne intended to stab him. Thorne's shoulder twitched. Karna smiled. Sounds like there's going to be quite the party, and Rivers would hate to miss out on it. As many of you know, Shin and I had our share of chasing garters. I was just a lieutenant the first time we engaged them. Perrin smiled at the memory of dragging a young, nervous Brillon through the forests for days and nights, trying to flush the garters like pheasants. They killed their first garter together, promoting them from mere officers to real soldiers. Karna was definitely no longer that hesitant officer, and probably had more experience with garters than anyone except Perrin. Karna continued, But it's time to let someone else get some experience, so I think I'll let Captain Rigoff battle it out with my lieutenant here for the honor of leading the river's contingency. Karna's lieutenant smiled back at him. He may be older, sir, but remember, I'm faster. Major Jordan, it would be an honor. Brillin chuckled and winked at Perrin. Perrin took a deep, contented breath. He thought getting the commanders to agree to an offensive would be far more difficult than this, but apparently sitting and waiting to be hit had become as tiresome to them as it was for him. Enough playing the wounded falcon. This bird may not have been able to fly out of the barn and edge, but he still had talons and a sharp beak and lots of fight. And now he had hunters. Are all of you mad? 12 pairs of eyes stared at the youngest officer in the room, whose face revealed that he regretted opening his mouth. Even the sergeants keeping notes looked up from their pages. But there was no going back now for Captain Thorne. His words hung in the air more obviously than Beneff's. Perrin folded his arms. Well, he had told him that officers' meetings usually included a bit of shouting. Captain Thorne looked at each of them, his eyes finally resting on Perrin. Colonel, with all due respect, since when is being the aggressor the prescribed method of defense? They never taught this in command school. Before Perrin could respond, Roaring Jordan did. You're right, Thorne, said Jordan, but the field is far different than what you've been taught in the classroom. We do an injustice to students, letting them believe that we've prepared them for life when they graduate. The university doesn't do that. Only experience does. That's why you're here, young man, to get that experience, not to tell us what some old men behind desks think was accurate a decade ago. He slapped the table. Hear, hear, said Karna. Fod smiled in agreement. But, Thorne gestured in exasperation. You're not supposed to go contrary to the prescribed methods without the explicit consent of the hierarchy. Sounds like you recited that straight out of the book, Thorne, said Perrin easily. The other soldiers chuckled. Well, I did, he defended. Considering who wrote it, I thought it was important to remember. You know who wrote that book, Colonel? Yes, I do, Thorne. My father, when he was first made the High General, and that was a few decades ago. It no longer applies. Perrin's voice grew husky. Much of what he wrote and believed no longer applies. Thorne, Jordan leaned across the table, you obviously can memorize and remember everything, but boy, you're inexperienced. Out here, you learn to think on your feet. There isn't a prescribed method for every situation. If I wrote to your grandfather for approval for every decision, nothing would ever get done. As commander, I am in command. If the High General doesn't like my decisions, he's welcome to come tell me himself. I like Colonel Shin's idea. It makes sense. No, it's not standard procedure. But these aren't standard times. He leaned back in his chair. Do you know why I became an officer? No, sir, Thorne said, his jaw set. Years ago. Now, mind you, I'm not as old Colonel Shin here, Jordan smirked. I'm only 42. But when I was a boy, my grandfather and grandmother disappeared. Really? Perrin had never heard this before. Jordan nodded to him before turning back to Thorne. First my grandfather, then the next day my grandmother. My father didn't know why or how. There was no forced entry into the house, no bloodshed, and no sign of them suddenly deciding to move and not tell anyone, which wouldn't have been in their nature anyway. A few unimportant papers were gone, but nothing else. My father called for the chief of enforcement the night my grandfather went missing. He and several enforcers scoured the village looking for clues. My grandmother sat distraught in the house with my mother. I remember her crying, and late into the night my mother fell asleep on their sofa. I was groggy and leaning against her when I felt someone kiss my forehead. I opened my eyes, and in the dim light I saw my grandmother. That was the last time anyone ever saw her. The next morning she was gone as well. Thorne had the decency to seem disturbed. I'm sorry to hear that, Major. But, sir, people go missing every year. It's not our domain. That's always been the responsibility of the enforcers. True, conceded Jordan, and my father had little faith in the enforcers of vines. After only one day, they gave up, said they had nothing to go on. My father went all the way to Idamia looking for someone to help, and he found someone willing to listen. High General Per Shin. Perrin studied his hands and gave them a small smile. Jordan continued. General Shin had heard of other people missing as well. He'd done some investigating on his own, and he had a theory that he shared only with my father. Garters. Perrin's head snapped up. His eyebrows furrowed in surprise. His hands came apart as he said, What? Major Jordan nodded. This was still the time of the kings, you realize, he said again to Thorne, who looked very interested. At the time, some suspected King Quarrel III actually controlled the Garters, or at least a small portion of them. It's handy to have a secretive society doing your dirty work for you, such as assassinating those who speak out against you. General Shin couldn't make his suspicions known, or he would have been the next victim. Jordan shifted his gaze to Perrin. I'm sorry, Colonel. I've never told anyone this before, but now it seems imperative. Perrin nodded his agreement. My father said the kings used a secret group of assassins. King Oren, not so much. When the administrators took over, Ralph thought he'd identified and eliminated the last of them that were still around. But I'm not sure he even knew of Pear's suspicions. That Garters might be abducting people? Over 100 years ago, yes, that happened. But 30 years ago? He never said anything about that to me. I'm sure your father didn't know, Jordan told him. When your grandfather died the next year and Ralph replaced him, all communication with my father stopped. I'm sorry, Gary. Per was a sloppy record keeper. I think that's why Ralph was so obsessed about his paperwork. He must have suspected information had been lost when Per died so suddenly. Perrin didn't finish, but went back to studying his hands. But Major Jordan, Thorne said, what would Garters want with an old man and an old woman? Jordan scoffed. They weren't old, Thorne. At least I don't consider 54 and 55 as old. Not since I turned 40, he admitted. But you ask a legitimate question. Why'd they take them? I'm not sure. I would have thought they weren't taken at all, but met with some kind of accident instead, if it weren't for the fact they went at different times. My grandmother knew something that she didn't tell us, and I think she was kissing me goodbye because she knew her fate. That's what's troubled me all these years. That's why I eventually chose a career that would allow me to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. Fod had been very quiet, listening. Jordan, he started tentatively, a family from Quake went missing about 4 weeks ago. A father, mother, and 2 little boys. No sign of forced entry. Jordan went wooden. People go missing all the time, Major, Captain Thorne reminded him. Maybe 100 every year. The ones recovered had been kidnapped by past lovers or by angry landowners looking for back rent. That's not our domain. Maybe they went for a walk and fell through the crust of a steam vent, or fell in a river and drowned. Little boys can't swim. They could have been washed away. Enough! Perrin barked, noticing Jordan's still frozen face. Thorne shut his mouth, frustrated. Fod ignored the captain. Jordan, do you remember any details about your grandparents' disappearance? Jordan shook his head. I was just 11 years old. So often I wished I'd asked my parents about it, but I never did before they passed away. Shem cleared his throat. Sirs, I wonder what would be the purpose of taking a family with 2 small boys? Fod shifted in his seat before answering. I must confess, Zenas, that idea that the family was taken occurred to me a while ago. I have nothing to go on but a hunch, but usually my hunches are correct. Consider, Master Sergeant, that if the garters are losing ranks, and since they were quiet for many years, that's a fair assumption, what better way to increase those ranks than by forced conscription? Kidnap new recruits. Shem groaned. Oh, in a few years, those little boys would be fully indoctrinated to fight for the garters. That's brilliant, Beneff said, shaking his head, because if the leather rips, ho ho. The officers ignored that. But why take the parents? Perrin wondered out loud, a terrible idea forming in his mind. Fod shrugged. Maybe to get to the boys. Maybe they don't even keep the parents once they have them. He cringed as he considered the same conclusion Perrin had drawn. Brillin blinked with a new idea. They might be in Moorland. Jordan clapped his hand on the table. That's why the house is in Moorland. To raise a new fighting force. Shin, they're growing a new force. Fod leaped to his feet. Colonel, those little boys. We can't attack children. Majors, Perrin raised his hand. Calm down. We've established nothing. We don't even know why that family vanished. Fod, who headed the investigation to their disappearance? The chief of enforcement, but I assisted, he said, slowly sitting down again. My wife knew them. Even though we can't have them, she loves children. They moved into our neighborhood a season ago, and my wife would sneak the boys sweets when they walked past. She was very distressed about their disappearance. Fod sighed, his eyes clouding. We found nothing at all. She's still searching when she can. How old were the boys? Perrin asked as gently as he could. 4 and 2, almost. Shem groaned again. Aw, just babies. I'm telling you, it's brilliant, Beneff said. The bears may break berries, but hee, get them while they're young. Beneff, Karna said, noticing that Fod's color had been fading. Enough, please. Beneff raised his hands, but his face still reflected appreciation. Gentlemen, Perrin said, do we have access to records about how many people have disappeared over the years? Honestly, Jordan, Fod, I think we're chasing after nothing here, but I am intrigued. Maybe there's a connection. Why are the garters in houses after all these years? It's worth looking into. Karna shrugged. We can contact all the chiefs of enforcement around the world and ask them for their numbers. I have a feeling they don't keep very good records about their failures, though. Probably true, Perrin said, but let's see what we can find. After all, Beneff began again, all water runs downhill. In the perplexed silence that followed that wholly accurate but still contextually odd comment from Beneff, a sergeant in the back whispered, While I understood that one, I still don't get it. Colonel, the young, slow captain piped up again, I'm afraid I still don't understand why the garters, if it were garters, would want to take Major Jordan's grandparents. Thorne turned to him. I realize the 50s aren't that old. My parents would agree with you there. He offered a small smile. Jordan didn't accept it. But of what value would they be? Thorne continued. Not everyone is as in excellent fighting shape as my father or you gentlemen, or would be when you are that age. His little speech was rapidly growing lame. Perrin smirked at Thorne's clumsy attempt at diplomacy. He was trying in so many ways. The captain has a point, he said reluctantly to the room, but maybe they weren't looking for soldiers. What did your grandfather do for a living, Gary? Jordan's broad forehead wrinkled in thought. He was a scientist. He worked for a time at the university in Idamia before moving to Vines. He was doing something with... The major tugged on his ear until his eyes lit up. Metallurgy. That was it. Slap. He was experimenting with different kinds of alloys. I remember all kinds of shiny samples in his study. Thorne tried not to scoff, but it came out anyway. What good is that to garters? Strength of metal, Perrin said evenly. The better the alloy, the stronger the sword, or dagger. Jordan nodded. He was working on swords for Quarrel the Fourth. He closed his eyes. Maybe that's what they were after. Better weapons. But why take his wife? Thorn pressed. Jordan looked at Shin for ideas. Perrin had one that he grudgingly shared. What better way to coerce a man to work than to threaten what's most precious to him? I'm sorry, Gary. Jordan closed his eyes again, and his hand rose to pinch the bridge of his nose. Shem put a consoling hand on his back. The major released his nose and smiled feebly at the men, but his eyes were fierce. Colonel Shin, you tell me the day and time and I'll be there with every man I have. Let's eliminate them now. He slapped the table. I appreciate your zeal, Major, but let's do a little more investigating first, Perrin suggested. All we've tossed around this morning are speculations and ideas. Let's spend a few days trying to find out who has disappeared in the last few years, and what evidence they left behind or didn't. Brillin shifted in agitation. But if we wait too long, the garters may attack us first. I know, Karna, I know, Perrin assured him. That's why I recommend we spend only a few days gathering evidence, and no more. We'll stay in contact until we have more information to go on. The idea that children are being housed is a long shot. But if there are children, and I don't care whose they are, ours or the garters, we will not harm them. Unlike the garters, we don't harm innocents. Is that understood? Understood and appreciated, Fod answered. Jordan shook his head. How innocent would those children still be, Shin? You and I both have sons. I'd rather my son die than ever have sympathy for the garters. Shem flinched and turned to Jordan. Major, certainly you don't believe that. Your own son? Jordan glanced at him before saying to Perrin, Would you want your son on the wrong side, Colonel? No, Jordan, I wouldn't, he said heavily. But I honestly don't know how I'd react if I found my boy with the enemy. I've never considered that possibility. Shem leaned across the table toward Perrin. You don't know? I do. You'd rescue him. You'd drag him out of there. Whatever dark corner of the cold wasteland they convinced him to reside in, you'd crawl into and retrieve him. The entire table of men was silenced by Shem, now on his feet in earnestness to make his point as he stared at Perrin. Perrin, startled, stared back. Jordan's voice broke the silence. Zenas, are you a father? Shem, his chest heaving, answered with his eyes still on his friend. No, not yet, but I feel like one. Perrin cocked his head. Jordan's voice came gently, along with the hand on Shem's shoulder to pull him back into his chair. Until you have a son, Zenas, you wouldn't know what such a betrayal would feel like. I appreciate your zeal, but you really don't understand. Shem slowly sat down, finally taking his eyes off the colonel. He nodded reluctantly to Jordan and folded his arms. Jordan now looked at Thorn, who seemed to enjoy the public conflict between Shem and Perrin. He had a small smile on his face that lasted only until he noticed Jordan glaring at him. And Thorn, until you know what it's like to lose family to the garters, you may not understand why some of us, he gestured to Perrin, refuse to wait for them to hunt us when we can hunt them first. He leaned on the table. Honestly, Lemuel, I don't know how your grandparents can sleep in that mansion. He kept his voice very low, and he glanced at Perrin to gauge his steadiness. Knowing what happened to the Shins, even under guard, which guard may not have been all the Shins were led to believe, Thorn wet his lips nervously. If I were you, dear Captain, I'd be in the lead of that first attack wave. You may be the only one who can preserve your grandparents and parents. Thorn swallowed hard, the weight of Major Jordan's words visibly piling on his shoulders. Then, sir, I guess I will have to race you to Moreland." Jordan broke out in a broad smile and nodded his approval to Colonel Shin. Perrin sent a fake smile to Thorne as well and slapped his hand on the table before Jordan could. Beneff slapped as well, "Because when the deer are in the meadow, you know the moons will soon be singing." That Beneff nugget froze every man in his position, as if every drop of thought was needed to evaluate the saying. Eventually Fod cleared his throat and leaned forward to resume his examination of the old man. "Beneff, what's a meadow?" "Meh," Beneff blurted, as if someone had just awakened him from the briefest nap in the world. "Yes, I was wondering that too." Jordan scratched his chin with his table-slapping hand. "Meadow?" Beneff blinked. Perrin noticed Shem watching him steadily. Shem shifted his glance to Perrin and pulled the corners of his mouth tightly, a signal which meant, "I'll have a word with the surgeon about him." Perrin twitched back in agreement. "You know," Beneff shrugged. "Meadow. Place where grass and flowers grow, deer eat them." "So like a garden." Fod, the investigator, watched him closely. "Next to the forests?" Beneff pondered that. "Garden? I suppose so, but people don't normally plant it, you see." Shem caught Fod's eye and shook his head slightly. Fod smiled faintly back. There wasn't that much to figure out about the old man. He was merely old. Glad to see that Beneff had confused himself into silence, Perrin slapped the table one last time. "1 week, gentlemen. We'll meet here again with our findings about the disappearances. Then we'll finalize the arrangements for the first offensive attack on the Garters. Agreed?" Even Thorne chorused his approval. And that's the end of the chapter. Thank you.